What happens when a racist cop profiles a black man during a traffic stop, unaware that he's an undercover FBI agent? This story is one of resilience, justice, and the fight against systemic prejudice. Let us know which country you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. Officer James Miller drummed his fingers against the steering wheel of his patrol car, his eyes scanning the quiet suburban streets of downtown Atlanta. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt, creating heat waves that shimmered in the distance. After 12 years on the force, Miller had developed what he considered an infallible instinct for trouble, though his colleagues had begun to question his judgment calls over the past few years. A sleek black Mercedes caught his attention as it passed through the intersection. The driver, a well-dressed black man, was following all traffic rules perfectly, almost too perfectly, Miller thought. Something about it didn't sit right with him. He pulled out behind the Mercedes, running the plates through his system. The registration was current and everything appeared in order, but Miller's prejudices had already taken hold. He flipped on his lights, watching as the Mercedes smoothly pulled over to the curb, signaling properly as it did so. The driver's methodical precision only served to heighten Miller's suspicions. In his mind, someone driving this kind of car in this neighborhood had to be involved in something illegal. He failed to recognize that his own biases were creating shadows where none existed. As he approached the vehicle, he deliberately placed his hand on his holster, a gesture that wasn't standard protocol for a routine traffic stop. Through the tinted windows, he could see the driver already had his hands placed at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, another detail that Miller somehow twisted into something suspicious, rather than recognizing it as a sign of someone who knew proper protocol during a traffic stop. He tapped on the window with his flashlight, despite the bright daylight, an unnecessary show of authority. As the window rolled down smoothly, the cool air from the car's interior brushed against Miller's face. The driver, dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit with a blue tie, looked up at him with calm, steady eyes. "Good afternoon, officer," he said in a measured tone. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" The man's composure and professional demeanor should have immediately diffused any tension, but for Officer Miller it only served to fuel his unfounded suspicions. Before the driver could reach for his documentation, Miller had already made up his mind about how this stop would proceed. The stage was set for what should have been a routine traffic stop to spiral into something far more significant, a moment that would not only change both men's lives, but would also spark a chain of events that would reverberate through the entire department. Neither the driver nor Officer Miller yet realized that this seemingly routine afternoon would become a catalyst for change in a system that had too long turned a blind eye to its own failings. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Miller barked, his voice carrying an edge of unwarranted hostility. The driver, who would later be identified as Marcus Thompson, maintained his professional composure despite the officer's aggressive tone. "Sir, I haven't been informed of any violation. I'd be happy to provide my license and registration." Miller cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I said step out of the vehicle, now!" Miller's voice rose, his hand tightening on his holster. Several passers-by slowed their pace, some already pulling out their phones to record what was quickly becoming a tense situation. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing through protocols, both as a citizen and as something else he couldn't reveal. He knew any sudden movement could be misconstrued, any word could be twisted. With deliberate slowness, Marcus opened his door, his hands visible at all times. The heat hit him as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the afternoon sun casting harsh shadows across the scene. "Sir, I want to cooperate fully, but I need to understand the reason for this stop." His voice remained steady, professional, the voice of someone used to navigating complex situations. Miller's response was to roughly grab Marcus's arm, spinning him around to face the car. The onlookers had grown in number, their phones capturing every moment of the escalating situation. A young woman stepped forward, clearly concerned, but Marcus caught her eye and slightly shook his head. He knew from experience that civilian intervention, while well-meaning, could make things worse. "Officer, I'm reaching for my ID now. It's in my left breast pocket," Marcus announced, clearly making sure his movements were slow and predictable. Miller responded by roughly patting him down, ignoring the offered information about the ID location. "I smell marijuana," he declared, though there was absolutely no evidence of drugs in or around the vehicle. It was a familiar tactic, one that Marcus had seen used countless times in his line of work, but usually from the other side of the equation. He remained silent, knowing that anything he said would only be used to justify the officer's action. The situation had spiraled from a routine traffic stop to a public spectacle in less than 5 minutes. More patrol cars were arriving, their lights flashing against the buildings and creating a carnival-like atmosphere that belied the serious nature of what was unfolding. Marcus could feel the cold metal of handcuffs being slapped onto his wrists, even as he continued to maintain his composure. He knew that every second of this interaction would be crucial later, though not in the way Officer Miller assumed. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Marcus sat handcuffed to the interview room chair, his expensive suit now wrinkled from the rough handling during his arrest. The clock on the wall showed 4:45 p.m. Nearly 2 hours had passed since the initial stop. He had remained silent during the transport, observing everything with the trained eye of someone who understood law enforcement from both sides of the bad. Officer Miller stood outside the room, speaking animatedly with Sergeant Sarah Chen, who had been called in when the arrest report raised several red flags. "Miller, you're telling me you arrested this man for resisting arrest, but you had no probable cause for the initial stop?" Chen's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen this pattern before. She held the arrest report in one hand, her other hand pressed against her temple in growing frustration. Inside the room, Marcus continued his patient wait, his mind already composing the report he would need to file, not with a local PD, but with his actual superiors. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. He had been in the middle of surveilling a suspected corruption ring within this very precinct when Miller's prejudiced actions had inadvertently brought him right into the heart of the operation. Sergeant Chen entered the room, notably without Miller, who watched through the window with growing unease. "Sir, I apologize for the delay. There seem to be some irregularities with your arrest that we're sorting out." She sat down across from Marcus, her demeanor professional but concerned. "Would you like to tell me your version of events?" Marcus straightened in his chair, his presence filling the room despite the handcuffs. "Sergeant, I think it's time we had a different kind of conversation." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I'm going to need you to contact Special Agent Roberts at the Atlanta FBI field office. My badge number is 8472 Alpha Delta." The shift in the room was palpable as Chen processed this information. Outside the window, Miller's face had drained of color as he watched the sergeant quickly verify the information on her phone. The reality of what he had done, arresting an undercover federal agent during an active investigation, was beginning to sink in, but what he didn't yet realize was that his actions had inadvertently provided exactly the kind of evidence the FBI had been looking for in their broader investigation of disproportionate practices in DSP crime. And, to that same extent, spying on federal agents, a department dedicated to cracking down on crime. Special Agent Roberts arrived at the station within 30 minutes, his presence causing a stir among the officers. He was a tall man with graying temples and the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. The handcuffs had been removed from Marcus as soon as his identity was confirmed, and he now sat in the captain's office, his suit jacket draped over a chair, engaging in intense discussion with both Roberts and Captain Gloria Martinez. His troop was collected at the hour center. "So you're telling me," Martinez said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "that not only did Officer Miller conduct an illegal stop and arrest, but he did so to an undercover federal agent who was actively investigating police misconduct?" She looked between Marcus and Roberts, the implications of the situation becoming clearer with each passing moment. Roberts nodded, his expression grave. "Agent Thompson has been undercover for the past 3 months, investigating allegations of systematic racial profiling and abuse of power within several precincts in the greater Atlanta area." He placed a thick folder on the captain's desk. "What happened today, while unfortunate for Agent Thompson, has provided us with clear evidence of exactly the kind of behavior we've been investigating." Outside the office, the news had spread through the precinct like wildfire. Officer Miller sat at his desk, his face ashen as he watched various senior officers and internal affairs investigators moving in and out of the captain's office. Several of his colleagues had already distanced themselves, leaving him isolated in a way he had never experienced before. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his voice steady as he addressed Captain Martinez. "This isn't just about Officer Miller. In the 3 months I've been undercover, I've documented numerous similar incidents. The difference is most victims don't have a badge to protect them when things go wrong." He pulled out his own notebook filled with detailed observations and incidents. What happened today is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The captain's office had become command central for what was quickly evolving into a major investigation. Internal affairs investigators were already pulling Miller's past arrest records, body camera footage, and civilian complaints. The pattern that was emerging was impossible to ignore. A clear history of disproportionate stops and arrests of minorities, excessive force complaints, and questionable probable cause citations. Marcus watched as the system he had been investigating began to turn its scrutiny inward. The irony wasn't lost on him that his own arrest would likely become the catalyst for the very changes he had been working to bring about. Through the office windows he could see other officers watching, some with concern, others with growing understanding of the changes that were about to come. The following morning, the precinct was buzzing with activity of a different kind. Internal Affairs had set up temporary offices in the conference room, their presence casting a shadow over the daily operations. Marcus, now openly wearing his FBI credentials, worked alongside IA investigators, his 3 months of undercover work providing crucial context to the mountain of evidence being compiled. Officer Miller had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, but he wasn't the only one under scrutiny. The investigation had expanded to include several other officers whose patterns of behavior had been flagged in Marcus's initial reports. The mood in the precinct was tense, with some officers worried about their own records, while others expressed relief that long-ignored issues were finally being addressed. Sergeant Chen had become an unexpected ally in the investigation, bringing forward her own documented concerns that had previously been dismissed or buried in bureaucracy. "I tried to raise these issues before," she explained to Marcus as they reviewed body camera footage from previous incidents. "But without concrete evidence or higher authority backing, it was too easy for the department to brush things aside," she added. The investigation team had set up a timeline of incidents on one wall of the conference room, creating a visual representation of the pattern of misconduct. Red pins marked confirmed cases of racial profiling, yellow for excessive force complaints, and blue for incidents where charges were later dismissed due to lack of probable cause. The pattern was undeniable, spreading across the wall like a web of systemic failure. Marcus spent hours interviewing other officers, some of whom came forward voluntarily with their own observations and concerns. The culture of silence that had protected bad behavior for so long was beginning to crack. Junior officers spoke about their attempts to report misconduct being met with warnings about loyalty and brotherhood. Veterans admitted to looking the other way, their initial idealism worn down by years of institutional pressure to conform. As the day wore on, the investigation began to reveal not just individual incidents of misconduct, but a deeper pattern of institutional failure. Training protocols, supervision practices, and departmental policies all came under scrutiny. Marcus knew that real change would require more than just removing a few problem officers. It would mean rebuilding the system from the ground. As the investigation entered its second week, the scope of Officer Miller's misconduct became increasingly clear. Marcus and the Internal Affairs team had uncovered dozens of similar traffic stops, each following the same pattern of racial profiling and escalation. The evidence room had been transformed into a command center, its walls covered with photographs, testimony transcripts, and statistical analyses. A detective, Sarah Martinez from Internal Affairs, pulled up another video on the large screen. "This one's from 3 months ago," she said, as the footage showed Miller conducting another traffic stop with alarming similarities to Marcus's experience. Same approach, same immediate escalation, same false claims about smelling contraband. The room fell silent as they watched the footage, the pattern unmistakable. Marcus stood before the evidence wall, connecting threads between incidents. "It's not just the individual stops," he explained to the assembled team. "Look at the geographic distribution." He gestured to a map marked with pins. Miller specifically targeted areas where successful professionals of color were likely to be driving through. He wasn't just profiling by race, he was specifically targeting individuals who defied his prejudiced expectations. The statistical analysis was damning. Of Miller's traffic stops over the past 3 years, 85% involved minorities, with a disproportionate number being successful professionals, doctors, lawyers, business executives. The pattern suggested not just racial bias, but a specific targeting of individuals who challenged his preconceptions. The investigation had also revealed something else: a network of informal protection within the department. Files had been buried, complaints had been dismissed, and warnings had been ignored. Several senior officers were now under investigation for their role in enabling Miller's behavior through their inaction or active suppression of complaints. As the team worked late into the evening, Marcus received a call from his FBI supervisor. "Thompson, this is bigger than we initially thought," the supervisor said. "We're getting similar reports from other precincts. Miller might just be the tip of the iceberg." Marcus looked around the room at the evidence they'd gathered, knowing that their investigation was about to expand far beyond one officer's misconduct. The story broke in the local media on a Wednesday morning. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution's headline read, "FBI investigation uncovers systematic racial profiling in Atlanta PD." Within hours, the precinct was surrounded by news vans, their satellite dishes reaching into the sky like metal trees. Community leaders and civil rights organizations quickly mobilized, organizing peaceful demonstrations outside the police headquarters. The crowd grew throughout the day, their signs telling stories of similar encounters, their voices united in demanding change. Marcus watched from his office window as Reverend James Wallace, a prominent local civil rights leader, addressed the gathering. "Today we have confirmation of what our community has known for years," Reverend Wallace's voice boomed through the microphone. "But today is different. Today we have proof. Today we have proof. Today we have allies within the system itself who are finally saying it." Inside the precinct, the mood was mixed. Some officers expressed relief that long-standing issues were finally being addressed, while others worried about a perceived witch hunt. Captain Martinez had called an all-hands meeting to address the growing crisis. "This is not about attacking the police," she declared to the assembled officers. "This is about making us better. This is about living up to the oath we all took to protect and serve everyone equally." Marcus spent the afternoon meeting with community leaders, listening to their stories and sharing his vision for reform. "What happened to me was not unique," he told them. "What is unique is that I was in a position to do something about it. Now, we need to create a system where every victim of profiling has the same opportunity for justice." The day ended with a candlelight vigil outside the precinct, where victims of racial profiling shared their stories. As Marcus listened, he realized that each account strengthened their case for systematic reform. The community's response had transformed a single investigation into a movement for change. Officer James Miller sat across from his union representative in a small conference room, reviewing the evidence against him. His face had grown gaunt over the past weeks, the weight of his actions finally settling on his shoulders. The stack of complaints, footage, and statistical analysis painted a picture he could no longer deny. James," his representative said gently, "given the evidence, we need to discuss your options." Miller stared at the footage playing on the laptop, his own body camera recordings showing stop after stop, each one revealing his biases in high definition. They're not just looking at what happened with Agent Thompson. They have 3 years of documented pattern and practice. But for the first time, Miller began to speak about his actions. "I always told myself I was just being thorough," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I convinced myself I was seeing things that weren't there, that my instincts were keeping people safe." He looked down at his hands, which had begun to tremble. I never let myself think about what I was really doing." The conversation was interrupted by his lawyer entering the room with new documents. The district attorney's office was offering a deal: resign from the force, cooperate with the ongoing investigation into departmental practices, and undergo intensive bias training. In return, they would not pursue criminal charges for civil rights violations. Marcus had requested to be present for Miller's decision, not out of vindictiveness, but because he believed in the importance of accountability and understanding. When Miller finally looked up to meet his eyes, something had changed in the former officer's expression. "I need to make this right," Miller said. "Not just for what happened with you, but for everyone I've wronged." The meeting lasted for hours as Miller began to detail his actions, his attitudes, and the departmental culture that had enabled him. His testimony would become a crucial part of the broader reform effort, a first-hand account of how bias could corrupt the judgment of those sworn to protect and serve. 1 month after the initial incident, Marcus stood before the Atlanta City Council presenting a comprehensive reform proposal. The chamber was packed with community members, police officers, and media representatives, all eager to hear how the department planned to address its systemic issues. "What we're proposing isn't just about new policies," Marcus explained, his voice carrying through the hushed chamber. "It's about fundamentally changing how we approach policing in our community." Behind him, slides showed the key points of the initiative: mandatory bias training, community oversight boards, revised traffic stop protocols, and a new system for tracking and analyzing officer behavior patterns. The proposal had been developed through a collaborative effort between the FBI, local law enforcement, and community leaders. Sergeant Chen, who had been promoted to lieutenant, presented the training components. "We're not just teaching officers what not to do," she explained. "We're helping them understand why these changes are necessary and how they make us all safer." The reform package included technological solutions as well. Every traffic stop would now be recorded and automatically uploaded to a database that would flag potential bias indicators. Body camera footage would be regularly reviewed by a diverse panel of officers and community members. Most importantly, there would be clear consequences for officers who showed patterns of discriminatory behavior. The testimony of former Officer Miller proved particularly powerful. His public acknowledgement of his biases and their impact helped convince skeptical council members of the need for change. "I'm not proud of what I did," he told the council, "but if my story can help prevent others from making the same mistakes, then maybe some good can come from it." As the council meeting extended into the evening, Marcus watched the various stakeholders working together to refine the proposal. It wasn't perfect, and there would be challenges in implementation, but it represented a real chance for meaningful change. The momentum for reform had built to a point where it could no longer be ignored or dismissed. 6 months after the traffic stop that sparked it all, Marcus stood in the training room of the Atlanta Police Academy, addressing a class of new recruits. The room looked different now. The walls adorned with photographs showing positive community interactions and statistics demonstrating the impact of unbiased policing. "Your training will be different from what officers received in the past," Marcus told the attentive faces before him. "You'll learn not just how to enforce the law, but how to recognize and overcome your own biases." The class was the most diverse in the Academy's history, a direct result of new recruitment initiatives implemented under the reform package. In the back of the room sat former Officer Miller, now working as a civilian consultant for the bias training program. His journey from perpetrator to advocate had been remarkable, though he was quick to acknowledge that he could never fully make up for his past actions. His presence served as a powerful reminder of both the damage bias could cause and the possibility of change. The department itself had undergone significant transformation. Regular community feedback sessions were now mandatory, and the new oversight board had real power to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. The early data showed promising results. Traffic stop disparities had decreased significantly, and community trust was slowly being rebuilt. Marcus's role had evolved as well. While still an FBI agent, he had become a bridge between federal law enforcement and local police departments nationwide, helping other cities implement similar reforms. The Atlanta model, as it came to be known, was becoming a template for departments across the country. As he concluded his presentation to the recruits, Marcus shared a final thought. "The badge you'll wear represents a sacred trust with the community," he said. "Every interaction, every decision, every moment matters. You have the power to either reinforce old prejudices or help build a new legacy of fair and just policing. The choice and the responsibility lies with each of you." Despite the initial success of the reforms, not everyone in the department embraced the new direction. A group of veteran officers, led by Sergeant Frank Dawson, began quietly organizing resistance to what they saw as an attack on traditional policing methods. Marcus had anticipated this pushback, knowing that cultural change never comes easily. "They're turning us into social workers," Dawson complained during a shift briefing, his voice carrying deliberately across the room. "All this sensitivity training is just going to make officers hesitate when they need to act." Several heads nodded in agreement, while others pointedly looked away, creating a visible divide within the ranks. Lieutenant Chen, now heading the reform implementation team, called a special meeting to address the growing tension. "I understand change is difficult," she acknowledged to the assembled officers, "but let me show you something." She projected a series of statistics on the screen. Crime rates hadn't increased under the new protocols, but civilian complaints had dropped by 40%, and officer injury rates had actually decreased. Marcus worked closely with the resistant officers, sharing real-world examples of how unbiased policing had led to better outcomes. He brought in officers from other departments who had successfully adapted to similar changes, creating a peer-to-peer dialogue that proved more effective than top-down directives. The turning point came when Sergeant Dawson himself was called to handle a potentially volatile situation in a predominantly minority neighborhood. Following the new protocols, against his initial instincts, he managed to de-escalate the situation without arrests or violence. The incident became a powerful example of how the reformed approaches could benefit both officers and civilians. By month's end, even some of the strongest opponents had begun to see the merits of the new system. While not everyone was fully convinced, the visible success of the reforms made it increasingly difficult to argue against them. The resistance hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had evolved into something more constructive, a dialogue about how to balance effective policing with fairness and respect. News of Atlanta's police reforms began attracting attention from departments across the country. Marcus found himself traveling frequently, consulting with police chiefs and city officials who were eager to implement similar changes in their own jurisdictions. The Atlanta model was becoming a blueprint for modern policing. In Chicago, a police commander reached out after seeing their success rates. "We've been trying to address these issues for years," she explained during a video conference. "But we never had a comprehensive framework like this." Similar calls came from departments in Los Angeles, Houston, and dozens of smaller cities, each dealing with their own versions of the same problems. The FBI created a special task force, headed by Marcus, to help coordinate these reform efforts nationwide. They developed standardized training materials, assessment tools, and implementation guidelines that could be adapted to different departmental sizes and community needs. Former Officer Miller's testimony became a powerful training tool, helping others recognize and confront their own biases. Academic researchers began studying the Atlanta reforms, documenting the measurable improvements in police-community relations. Dr. Sarah Williams, a prominent criminologist, published a paper highlighting the program's success. What makes the Atlanta model unique is its comprehensive approach, combining policy changes, technology, training, and community involvement in a way that addresses both individual and systemic issues. Local businesses and community organizations became actively involved in supporting the reforms. The Chamber of Commerce funded additional training programs, while neighborhood groups organized regular meetings with patrol officers, building personal relationships that helped break down stereotypes on both sides. The media coverage shifted from sensational headlines about police misconduct to in-depth stories about positive changes and community healing. Marcus watched as the narrative transformed from one of crisis to one of hope and progress, though he remained mindful that sustained change would require ongoing commitment and vigilance. The reforms weren't just changing policies, they were changing people. Marcus began collecting stories of individual transformations, both from officers and community members. These personal narratives became powerful testimony to the human impact of the reform efforts. Officer Sarah Rodriguez, a 5-year veteran, shared her story during a training session. "I never thought of myself as biased," she admitted to the group, "but the new training made me realize how many assumptions I was making on patrol. Now I approach each situation fresh, without preconceptions, and I'm actually better at my job because of it." Community members noticed the change too. James Washington, a local business owner who had previously filed multiple complaints about police harassment, reported a complete shift in his daily experiences. "The officers who patrol my neighborhood now, they know my name, they know my business, they treat me like a person, not a suspect," he told Marcus during a community feedback session. Former Officer Miller continued his own journey of growth and redemption. He began working with youth groups, sharing his story as a cautionary tale and an example of the possibility of change. Though some community members were initially skeptical of his involvement, his genuine remorse and commitment to reform gradually earned him a measure of respect. Lieutenant Chen developed a mentorship program pairing veteran officers with newer recruits, focusing on building a culture of ethical, unbiased policing from the ground up. "We're not just changing how we police," she explained during a program launch, "we're changing how we think about policing itself." The personal stories became an integral part of the training program, helping officers understand that reform wasn't just about following new rules, it was about growing as individuals and professionals. Marcus documented these transformations, building a powerful narrative about the human capacity for change and growth. 1 year into the reforms, new challenges emerged that required the program to evolve. Budget constraints threatened some of the new training initiatives, while a series of high-profile crimes led to public pressure for more aggressive policing. Marcus and his team had to find ways to maintain the reforms while addressing these legitimate concerns. Captain Martinez called an emergency meeting with community leaders and department heads. "We need to show that reformed policing can be both fair and effective," she declared. The group worked late into the night, developing strategies to address public safety concerns while maintaining their commitment to unbiased policing. Technology proved both a help and a hindrance. The new data analysis systems were providing valuable insights into policing patterns, but some officers complained about feeling micromanaged. The Oversight Committee worked to fine-tune the monitoring protocols, finding a balance between accountability and officer autonomy. A spike in gang activity in one district tested the new approaches. Lieutenant Chen led a response team that demonstrated how community-oriented, unbiased policing could effectively address serious crime. Their success helped quiet critics who claimed the reforms had made the department soft on crime. Marcus worked with the Budget Committee to secure private funding for continuing the training programs. Local corporations, seeing the benefits of improved police-community relations, stepped up with support. The challenge of sustaining the reforms led to creative solutions and new partnerships. The department also had to address officer burnout and morale issues. The intense scrutiny and constant adaptation required by the reforms took a toll on personnel. New support systems were implemented, including counseling services and regular check-ins, helping officers manage the stress of policing under the new paradigm. 18 months after the traffic stop that sparked the reforms, Marcus prepared a comprehensive report for the FBI and Department of Justice. The data told a compelling story. Civilian complaints had dropped by 60%, use of force incidents were down 45%, and officer satisfaction ratings had actually improved by 30%. Independent auditors confirmed the findings. Dr. Williams returned to conduct a follow-up study, this time focusing on the long-term sustainability of the changes. "What we're seeing in Atlanta isn't just a temporary adjustment," she reported. "These reforms have fundamentally altered the culture of policing in the city." Community surveys showed significant improvements in public trust. Even in neighborhoods that historically had tense relationships with law enforcement, residents reported feeling more confident in their interactions with police. Traffic stop data showed no significant racial disparities for the first time in the department's recorded history. The success metrics weren't just statistical. Marcus collected hundreds of personal testimonials from officers and civilians alike, documenting the human impact of the reforms. These stories, combined with the hard data, created a powerful argument for the effectiveness of the new approach. During a national law enforcement conference, Atlanta's program was highlighted as a model for 21st century policing. Marcus watched from the audience as Lieutenant Chen and Captain Martinez presented their results to chiefs and commissioners from across the country. The reforms that had begun with one biased traffic stop had grown into a movement that was reshaping American law enforcement. 2 years after the initial incident, Marcus stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a congressional committee on police reform. The hearing room was packed with legislators, law enforcement officials, and civil rights leaders, all eager to hear about Atlanta's successful transformation. What happened to me that day could have ended like so many other tragic encounters between law enforcement and minorities, Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. Instead, it became a catalyst for change. He detailed the comprehensive reforms, sharing both data and personal stories that demonstrated their effectiveness. The committee was particularly interested in how the Atlanta model could be scaled nationally. Questions came rapid fire from both sides of the aisle. How much did the reforms cost? How were they funded? What about smaller departments with limited resources? Marcus had anticipated these questions, presenting detailed implementation plans for departments of varying sizes and budgets. Former Officer Miller testified as well, his story adding a powerful personal dimension to the policy discussion. "I'm not proud of who I was," he told the committee, "but I'm proud of what these reforms have accomplished." His testimony helped convince skeptical members that meaningful change was possible, even among officers with long. The hearing concluded with broad bipartisan support for a national police reform bill based on the Atlanta model. As Marcus left the Capitol building, he was approached by numerous police chiefs and city officials, each eager to begin implementing similar changes in their own jurisdictions. The momentum for national reform had become unstoppable. The Atlanta Police Academy had been transformed in the wake of the reforms. Marcus observed a graduation ceremony for the newest class of officers, noting how different their training had been from previous generations. These recruits had undergone extensive bias awareness education, community engagement training, and scenario-based learning. Valedictorian Officer Maria Hernandez addressed her fellow graduates. "We're entering law enforcement at a pivotal time. Our training hasn't just taught us how to enforce the law, it's taught us how to serve our community with dignity and respect." The audience, a diverse mix of family members, veteran officers, and community leaders, responded with enthusiastic applause. Lieutenant Chen, now heading the Academy's training program, had implemented innovative teaching methods that combined traditional police skills with emotional intelligence and cultural awareness. The results were evident in the confident, community-oriented attitudes of the new officers. The graduation ceremony included a unique element. Community members shared their hopes and expectations with the new officers. This dialogue set the tone for the kind of relationship-based policing that had become Atlanta's hallmark. Marcus watched with pride as the new officers engaged thoughtfully with the citizens they would soon serve. Former Officer Miller, who now regularly spoke to Academy classes, presented the Outstanding Community Service Award. The moment symbolized how far the department had come, from his biased traffic stop to helping shape a new generation of unbiased officers. As the reforms entered their third year, Marcus worked with researchers to document the long-term impacts of the changes. The findings were impressive. Not only had biased policing incidents practically disappeared, but overall police effectiveness had improved. Crime rates were down, community cooperation had increased, and officer retention rates were at historic highs. The department had become a learning laboratory for progressive policing techniques. Officers from across the country and around the world came to study Atlanta's methods. The training programs continued to evolve, incorporating new technologies and responding to emerging challenges while maintaining their core focus on unbiased, community-oriented policing. Captain Martinez, now Chief Martinez, implemented additional reforms that built on the original changes. The department established a permanent community oversight board with real power to influence policy. Regular town halls and community feedback sessions became institutional fixtures, ensuring that the reforms remained responsive to community needs. The city's success had sparked a broader conversation about the role of police in society. Other public institutions began examining their own practices for potential bias, leading to widespread changes in schools, courts, and government offices. Atlanta had become a model not just for police reform, but for institutional transformation. Marcus reflected on how a single incident had grown into a movement that was reshaping American law enforcement. The changes hadn't been easy, and there had been plenty of resistance along the way, but the results spoke for themselves. The legacy of the reforms would continue to influence policing for 3 years to the day after the traffic stop. Marcus sat in his office reviewing files from departments across the country that had implemented similar reforms. On his wall hung photos documenting the journey, the original protest gatherings, the first graduation of reformed trained officers, the congressional hearing, and countless community meetings. He thought about Officer Miller, who had transformed from a symbol of biased policing into an advocate for change. Miller now traveled the country sharing his story, helping other officers recognize and confront their own biases. His journey of redemption had become as important to the reform movement as Marcus's original experience. Lieutenant Chen, whose promotion to deputy chief was just announced, stopped by his office. "Remember when we thought this might be just another internal investigation?" she asked with a smile. They discussed how the reforms had exceeded their initial expectations, creating ripples of change throughout the criminal justice system. The community had been transformed as well. Marcus regularly received messages from citizens sharing positive interactions with police, a marked contrast to the fear and distrust that had once characterized police-community relations. Local businesses that had once viewed police with suspicion now participated actively in community policing initiatives. As he prepared to leave for another consulting trip to help another city implement reforms, Marcus reflected on how a moment of potential tragedy had been transformed into an opportunity for lasting change. The incident that could have ended his career instead launched a movement that was reshaping American policing. The story concluded where it began, at a traffic stop on a sunny Atlanta afternoon, but this time Marcus watched as one of the academy graduates he had trained handled the situation. Officer Hernandez approached the vehicle with respect and professionalism, explaining the reason for the stop clearly and listening to the driver's response. The interaction was a model of unbiased policing, professional, respectful, and focused on public safety rather than preconceptions. Marcus observed how naturally the new protocols had become, how the reformed training had created a new standard for police. The driver, an elderly black man, later attended a community feedback session to praise Officer Hernandez's professionalism. "I've lived in Atlanta for 60 years, he said, and I never thought I'd see the day when a traffic stop could make me feel safer rather than afraid." In his final report to the FBI, Marcus wrote, "The transformation we witnessed in Atlanta demonstrates that meaningful change is possible when we confront our biases honestly and commit to doing better. What began as a single incident has become a blueprint for national reform, proving that justice and effective law enforcement are not opposing goals, but essential partners." As the sun set on another day in Atlanta, Marcus watched the new generation of officers patrolling their beats, interacting with community members and living the principles of unbiased policing. The city had shown that change was possible, that old wounds could heal, and that a single moment of injustice could be transformed into a movement for lasting reform. That brings us to the end of this story. If you love to hear more stories like this, be sure to like this video and click that subscribe button for daily uploads. See you next time.